Hey again, everybody. I'm glad to see those of you who are here. This is the final panel of today's great seminar, and we have two wonderful guests. And I'm listed as moderator, and Natalia's like, "Stay up, dialogue." And I'm itching to talk about this stuff, so sure, here I am up on the panel. But I'm gonna, try to. I will leave the space predominantly for Eduardo and Natalia, who have a lot of interesting analysis and experience to bring to bear. And this roundtable is Transnational Solidarity Politics, Reflections by Organizers. Our first speaker will be Eduardo Vianna, who is a professor of psychology, is that right? Psychology? At the City University of New York, and an organizer formerly with Defend Democracy in Brazil, and BRADO. Eduardo Vianna is a professor here. Said that he's a professor in the following programs: the psychology program at LaGuardia Community College, and the developmental psychology and urban education PhD programs at the Graduate Center. His research focuses on connecting teaching, learning, and developmental processes in various settings that serve underprivileged and minoritized populations. Working from a Vygotskian perspective, especially the transformative activist stance approach, he has carried out research on applying critical theoretical pedagogy in community college. This includes building a peer-based co-curricular program to connect affect and agency in learning. He is the lead editor for Outlines, Critical Practice Studies, and has been directly involved with Brazilian activist groups in New York fighting for democracy and social justice, including developing popular educational initiatives. And then Natalia de Campos is a multidisciplinary performance artist and producer, educator, writer, translator, and activist from Sao Paulo, based in New York since 1998. A co-founder and co-director of the performance and political activist group Defend Democracy in Brazil Committee in New York since 2016, with whom she organized over 250 street actions, lectures, media actions, and more. Natalia works in performance and theater, interactive media, social practice, and street interactions as a theater actor, director, and producer of solo or collaborative works under Syncretic Pleasures, Art and Calm, and United Artists and Activists Union. She has presented her own work in venues around downtown New York City, performing and toured to Brazil with the Living Theater, performed in Mikhail Baryshnikov's White Oak at BAM and others. She is a member of the Lincoln Center Theater Directors Lab, holds an MFA in Performance and Interactive Media Arts from CUNY, a BA in History from the University of Sao Paulo, presented her research at the International Theater Conference in Santiago, Chile, and also lectured at multiple events at New York University following the election of Bolsonaro, at the US NDB annual meeting, and at the George Washington University in DC, among others. As co-coordinator and curator, she organized political education events about Brazil at CUNY, NACLA, NYU, the People's Forum, the Left Forum at LIU, Columbia University, GWU, and with the International Network of Brazilian Activists, FIBRA, among many others. Natalia currently teaches Portuguese and about Brazil's social movements at the People's Forum in New York. She is a member of the executive and steering committees of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. More info at some URLs that you can find on the programs. And I'll just actually say one other quick word of introduction. I'm not Brazilian. I do research in Brazil. I have deep ties to Brazil. I love a lot about Brazil and a lot of people in Brazil. And in 2016, when there was the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, which I think is most accurately referred to as a coup, although some people would disagree with that, but I think it's the right description. It started to become, really kind of worried about this country that I have such deep ties to. And I saw that, there was all this activism going on here in this area where I live. But it wasn't really until 2018, as it began to look possible that Bolsonaro was going to be elected, that I started saying, well, I better kind of get out and get involved in some way, particularly since, and this is a topic that hasn't come up here, but it's important. The United States has been involved in this whole process. As the United States has been involved with many, non-democratic kind of right-wing takeovers of power in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. And the United States was involved in the process of the deterioration of Brazilian democracy over the last half decade or so, or a little more than that. And so, it seemed important to me to try to do what I could to get involved. And so I started meeting some of these wonderful folks and other Brazilian activists in the region doing great work. So it's a real pleasure to be on stage with these two wonderful intellectuals and artists, activists, and I give up the floor now to Eduardo.
Thank you, Sean. I'm going to start with a YouTube video, and I'll give you context as we go along. So this was in early September 2017, and this is Henrique Meirelles, then Finance Minister of Brazil, and he just left the Pierre Hotel when he came together with then President Michel Temer to sell our national companies abroad. So, and yeah, you can play them. One of those folks yelling is me. So there's another video you can see. And this actually is journalist Malu Gaspar, who now writes for Global, one of the most prominent newspapers in Brazil. And she was there interviewing him for a profile for POV magazine, which is like a progressive, like intellectual magazine. So this was on a Wednesday at noon, right? And I was there because that was my sabbatical year, and I went there with 3 friends from our collective. And so this, I wanted to show this to illustrate that kind of network, right, that we created, and I'll say we, Natalia and I, and and many others, right, that began in 2016, and so it grew to a point that every right-wing politician from Brazil, right, who sets foot in New York will be well received, by us, right? And this is new, right? And when Gladys presented the results of the election in New York, right, showing big difference from 2018 to now, I want to take a little bit of credit for us, right? The work that we've done here. So I'm gonna, go back in time. So I moved to the US in 96, and I did my PhD at CUNY. And for most of my life, I've been, an activist, but an academic activist. I've not really taken, since I was in Brazil, I saw Lula being elected. I was there at the Graduate Center when he came to launch a new popular banking program. And, we're so proud to see Brazil, right, on the cover of The Economist, right, Christ Redeemer launching, right? So everything seemed fine until well, in 2013, as Vanya mentioned, we had a public protest in Brazil, but okay. Then I remember in 2014, Dilma was reelected, and that was at the height of the corruption scandal at the oil company. And she hardly made it. It was like she won by a small margin. But I remember going home that day, celebrating the results and taking a deep breath, like, okay, these 4 more years that I don't have to be so involved, because at that time I took to Facebook and I was doing a lot of activism, and folks in Brazil was like, oh, it's because you're in the US, you're not here in Brazil. Like the Workers' Party, he betrayed us, it's corruption. And it's like, well, I keep up with the news. I see what's going on, right? And then in 2015, I remember I was in Rio with my parents, and it was just sickening. It was really toxic. They watched TV Global, the main news channel, and the news, the morning news, lunchtime news, and the evening news. It was like how Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party, how they broke the country, and how the policies left, huge deficit, and how they were corrupt, how Lula was a thief. And that was that was my diet. And I was like, stop this. It was really toxic. And I'm bringing this, I think like our panelists this morning, they did a fantastic job, but sort of like a bottom-up approach, explaining, right? I analyzed how is it that poor people, like Black people, gays, come to support, right? Bolsonarism, right? But I want to bring this more top down because, right, the media played a huge role in this, right? Together with other institutes like the Mises Institute. So 2013 was really I think is the birth of this new phase of right wing, which of course has deep roots, right, in Brazilian society. We had our 64 right wing group, but that was really a starting point where this kind of like this agenda, right, a social agenda, gay rights, Black movement, all of that was appropriated by the right, right? When as a basically say like a bit of a cover up for the ultra neoliberal agenda. So then back in 2016, when finally the impeachment was, the movement to impeach the work staff, right, with the coup, as Sean said, I saw it was really growing, right? And out of, desperation, I was seeking out, other folks in the area, right? And then I met Natalia and their group, and we took to the streets. Okay? And we staged so many protests, right? In New York, and we began to, welcome, right, those right-wing politicians. So there was like a remarkable event, and that was organized at Columbia University when Judge Morrow, like the partisan judge, right, who sentenced Lula right, to jail, and then became minister right, for his opponent, right? That's how screwed up it all is, and there was like a protest against it, where like one by one, right, we planted speakers in the audience, and everybody got up, right, and booed him, and of course were taken out. So we also showed a lot of support for Dilma before being impeached. Brazil is the first country to speak at the opening of the year at the UN, right? And we went there to show support, and we kind of played a role in changing the narrative, because they thought, right, that they could say that internationally, right, that there was overwhelming support for the group, and they didn't expect, right, that would be, right, people like us, protesting. And it was actually surprising when it came to the UN, they had organized it, and they were like barricades, right, and they separated us, right, people on the left defending Dilma, right, and people on the right with their yellow and green shirts, right? And it's like, I'd never seen, the kind of polarization, but we went to the house of the Brazilian ambassador in the Upper East Side, where right-wing protesters had, planned, to attack her, but actually we were in greater numbers, right, than they were. And just to kind of, cut a long story short, we began to form like this really sprawling network that also included cultural events that began to aggregate people from the Brazilian community. And years later, like with Samba, for example, right, bringing people together. And then, in 2017, when we had this, then Dilma was ousted, and we had President Temer. And we also began to do events. I organized events at both the LaGuardia Community College and the Graduate Center. So we had, there's always researchers and scholars from Brazil visiting. Sean also gave a talk to us, and we were trying to bring the community into the university. We once came to to the Ironbound, we went to the Lutheran church, and I feared for our safety at the time. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we were really creating a network here, right? And then collectives, as we call them, began to proliferate. We also were feeding blogs in Brazil, such as this one that I just showed you. And at the time this went viral, it had like more than 1 million views. And I was actually surprised that I got we reached a right-wing cousin that I have, and he was like, send me a WhatsApp message. Was that you? Right? So yes, that was me. So we had like this distinct phases. That first was protesting, denouncing the coup against Dilma. Then soon after was organizing against the lawfare, against President Lula, who was, unfairly convicted, and on his sentence, he's convicted of an indeterminate act. I kid you not. I'm being literal here. Okay? And we created committees in New York to support Lula. Then we began to partner with other organizations such as the People's Forum that Natalia already mentioned. And we had an event that we invited Lula's daughter, Lurian, to speak at that event. Prior to that, we had done an event where we invited Benedita da Silva, who was like a House representative from Rio de Janeiro from the Workers' Party. And it was about the assassination of Marielle Franco. We had Marielle's partner also at that event. I'm going to give another example. The day Marielle was assassinated, I was at a common friend house, and then we were so very shocked and started calling each other, and then we organized a protest the very next day at Union Square, and it was like it was a massive show of support and protest. I remember also that that week we organized together with the Jewish Voice for Peace an event in front of the Brazilian consulate to denounce Marielle's assassination. So things were growing and proliferating, and other collectives were being formed, and we were it was like showing movies and having lectures. So I guess what I wanted to end with is that I guess I could say there was like a little bit of a beginning of kind of popular education that's sorely needed. And I want to, when we have time for Q&A, to talk about that. Maybe, certain tropes, right, that we hear, not only among Brazilian immigrants, but, especially in Brazil, right? Like meritocratic discourses, for example, right? So last year when I was in Rio, there was like a hot day. There was a series of hot days in August where people from the periphery they come to the beaches, right, in the richer area of town, and the middle class, the elite, they were offended by that, right? And talking with a Uber driver about that. It's like, well, come on, what can you expect? Because they say, oh, they come, it's a mess, they don't respect, they have no values, and it's like, well, what do you expect, right? What opportunities they have for for leisure, and right? It's like, no, I'm sorry, I grew up in a community, I grew up in a favela, I don't act like that, right? So it's this kind of discourse that's I think we have to engage directly, right? That people think that why should the government, right, support people who are lazy, who are not working hard, right? So I guess I kind of trying to understand how come like poor working people support, right, this political agenda, right, that hurts them, right, in the first place, right? And together with that, like you add to the mix. And as Mina was saying, there's like a mixed bag of everything, of patriarchy, racism, homophobia. So all of that, right, gets to be thrown in the mix. And organizing during electoral periods, it's a lot harder because of the polarization, right? But I remember when we had events, like after Dilma was ousted, we had Timmer as the president. And one of the first things that they tried to do was to dismantle our welfare programs. They wanted to change the rules for retirement. And they passed a bill to freeze spending, which actually is social investment, right, for 20 years. And I remember it was during Carnival, and we went to spots where we have Brazilians, right, just giving people information about what was at stake, right? And those were a lot more successful because even, right, because you're not supporting a candidate, right, talking about a social issue. Now, of course, then we had COVID, right? The university was closed, so kind of everything, right, took a bad seat. But I think it would be, great to start bringing these efforts back together. And I think that, Vanya, spoke this morning. If Lula wins, and he's poised to win, hopefully, right? But we have a fight, right, ahead, because we have these elements like deeply ingrained in our society, and we do need dialogue, right? Because if we are dogmatic on our side, and last year I spent almost the entire year in Brazil, and again talking with drivers, waiters, and listening, for example, to your perspective on lockdowns, which were poorly executed in Brazil, right, or rules of vaccination. And there's a tendency on the left to call them cattle, Bolsonaro supports, right? And at times it does sound that these are unreasonable people, but when you listen to them, right, many of them are highly articulate. I might not agree, right, with their position, right? But just to outright reject them as irrational, I don't think that does us, right, any good. And I think the answer is really like, this kind of gray area approach that we can bring people together, right, to discuss these issues. And just to perhaps put a little, give more context, because I guess right now we're a little bit more relieved, but over the years, right, it was like loss after loss, right? We felt defeated, right? I could not believe. Right? So that's why my academic work took a back seat, because I had to go to the street. And by the way, after this, my mother called me from Brazil, and she had stern words, right, against me. It's like, these people are dangerous. You don't know what you're doing. You have a child, But it was my sabbatical year. I left New York right after. Just give you like just a sense, right? How intense, right? Like the political got really personal, if we could use that expression. And I think perhaps now we can, right, start changing the conversation, having conversation in different ways. So, for example, the example of samba, it's a good one, because you begin to organize, right, politically, but not with a political agenda at the forefront, right? But together with that, we're talking, about bringing the Black movement, right, together with samba, right, into this, and capoeira circles. So I guess I wanted to end in a more optimistic note, like trying to see the glass half full, because we have lost so much, but we can also see this as a reaction also to so much progress, right, that happened in Brazil, right? And I think like race, as I said, is a big issue, because our racial and ethnic identity, right, was challenged, and that's right. It's just too much to people. Just sharing some books when I moved here, and I learned that I wasn't white, because in Brazil I passed, right? I mean, these are right. Like Amina was saying, there's some deep psychological, right? Anybody who's read Fanon, right, will understand that, right? So it takes a lot of courage, a lot of guts to see, right, that we are attached, right, right, to privilege, right, to our fantasies of power, and same thing with, right, with gender. It's like, you trying to understand why would any woman support Bolsonaro? There's so many in my family, on my father's side, right, that do so, right? So that right, things are very deeply ingrained, and but I think the good side is that, yeah, there has been a challenge, to that. So things are now, right, in flux. So we are seeing this right wing backlash, but right, hopefully, right, we'll be able to, to move forward. So that's, yeah.
Next up is Natalia de Campos.
You. So just before I start playing this, we prepared a slideshow to give a little bit of a. So first, I wanted to thank Sean Mitchell for the invitation, and everyone, Sarah, Vianna, me, and Bernard for the support to get here, and also to do all the backstage work that's so important in everything that is done here. Everything is done outside on the streets. That is the story that is untold most of the time. And I think it's very important to be in Newark. I also wanted to acknowledge that I worked with an artist, stellar artist, African American feminist activist for 15 years in New York, who was a professor at Rutgers for 28 years at Mason. She got to be a chair at Mason Gross Arts College. And so it's a super honor to be at Rutgers, and also in Newark, because we have done a lot of work in the last year, especially towards the elections in Newark. And I was, super honored with the invitation. So while I speak, you will see a humongous amount of images, and that is sort of like the last 7 years of work of the Defend Democracy in Brazil committee, but also in partnership with several groups, and also lately with the Popular Committee for Struggle to elect Lula. And I won't be biased here, but just to declare that it is to elect Lula, nothing different than that. And I'm saying this too because for many years, of these years that we mentioned, we had to be ashamed sometimes of saying that we were for Lula or for the Workers' Party, or to be, sort of very blunt, because we wanted to attract also people from the middle grounds or people who do not support. So here you see some of the images from the first year and second years when the group started honestly with a group of friends that were very tied together. And we started also with, sorry, I got it back because this is going super fast. Next question. Sorry about that. I'll just start over because, so the beginning of the group was a group of friends, like I said, as a reaction to Cunha, who was the head of the House of Representatives in Brazil, and with a very strong evangelical tie to the anti-abortion movement. And that was cutting out, all of the women's rights and trying to attempt a very right-wing Congress, which was already right-wing anyway. But that, and his lack of agreement with the Workers' Party led him to actually put forth the impeachment proceedings against Dilma Rousseff. And then in February 2016, that's when the Democracy was actually formed on the streets of New York. Many people came together besides that the initial group of friends, and that brought a lot of the Brazilian community together here in New York specifically, and then enlarging to the larger community. So several of these protests that happened at Union Square were prior to Dilma coming to New York, and then she did come when Eduardo mentioned she first came, it was actually for the Paris Agreement. So now it wasn't for the General Assembly, and that's when she was still president, and we went out there to support her. And there were opposers, a small group of MBL, which is Movimento Brasil Livre supporters, that tried to sort of oppose us, but we were a much larger group at the time. And when that happened, this is right after the impeachment proceedings. So we did a performance that considered the democracy to be basically, and I'll play this video for you. Basically, it would consider that democracy was killed. So the group is very much geared towards art performance and activist performance as a way to activate the audience. So most of the performances we've done were out on the streets. And this is Brazilian Day, which is a very strong right-wing event supported by Global TV that is responsible by the narrative that that Eduardo described. And so we had a number of supporters photographers. This is a famous photographer, Marcelo WC. We went to his studio and then prepared that and went out to the streets after the photo shoot. And I'm just showing one, but there were several performances like this with different things about the Olympics, and later, you know, with Bolsonaro once he got elected. And 2016 was a particularly strong year for the performances, right? Out on the street until Dilma was impeached. And this is the reaction of people who were not our supporters. So we always combine sort of the political education, the flyering, you know, with movement and visual effectiveness. So they close out 6th Avenue in Manhattan and do this big stage supported by Global. And that was, you know, first time that people were seeing these being questioned among the community of right-wing supporters. So some, as you saw, were very particular about showing that they were not with us. I think it's gonna go on. Let's see. So this is in 2016 still. Yeah, it's fine, right? Yeah. So this is part of the beginning of the campaign to stand with Lula when his lawyers came to New York, and we were there in one day protesting against Temer, the vice president who was a traitor to Dilma and came to the UN for the General Assembly. And in the afternoon, we went to this campaign to stand with Lula, and that was the beginning of the campaign. And that was even a year and a half before he actually went to jail. It was a long process of, you know, diminishing the Workers' Party and doing lawfare against Lula and making the consciousness of the Brazilian people and the international audience to understand that he had done something wrong when there was no evidence whatsoever. So in 2017, we brought Dilma. This is the protest actually against Sérgio Moro that Eduardo mentioned. And then Dilma Rousseff. There was also a break in the group at the time. And that is one of the things I wanted to address. And it's unfortunate that the right wing seems to be so much better organized in terms of they have no other agendas. Although we are progressing with our, discussions and different approaches on the left on how to be more horizontal, more democratic, and racially inclusive, and so on. We also end up losing a lot in by way of disorganizing instead of organizing in terms of fracturing the groups and so on. And so there was a big fracture at the time that Eduardo Vianna came to New York, and it affected a lot of how the groups would both operate, right? The groups that sprang out of differences. And in that sense, we were still able to do many of the protests and events that were necessary to continue to denounce New York. From very early on, we realized that organizing in New York had a huge voice in the press, especially to reflect back in Brazil. So at first, we were just echoing protests, and then we started to really use to our advantage the media advocacy that the democracy in Brazil does. And so we helped bring him to Democracy Now! to speak about the possibility that he would be jailed only 2 weeks after the assassination of Natalia de Campos. So he spoke on that, and he also spoke just 2 weeks before he went to jail. And that was an important factor to start changing the consciousness of Americans about what was being reported in the New York Times, as I mentioned in the questions I had for Gladys and for the other panelists before, this idea that people would believe the mainstream Reuters, New York Times narrative that would talk about Lula being corrupt, or that would talk about Dilma having had a legal reason for impeachment, which was not the case. And so the constant denouncement with all of these actions, with a lot of media advocacy, a lot of events at universities, as we mentioned too, and organizing panelists and bringing, we saw also a surge of Brazilian activists and politicians having to flee Brazil because of attacks of Bolsonaro supporters at the time, but not only just right wing or extreme right growing, and death threats, they receiving death threats that they had to flee from, and many ended up here in New York. So we organized many. So this is, for example, this is a protest that we did with the unions here in the US. I want to acknowledge one of my union friends here in the audience, Neil, who was being a supporter of Free Lula campaign and Lula to presidency as well. And this is in New York, actually. So we did the Vira Voto, which was trying to turn the vote at the last moment just before Bolsonaro actually got elected. And then finally here on December 1st, we supported and our members until this day of the US Network for Democracy in Brazil. Fernando Haddad, who was just in that picture, was the incumbent. Also, it was running against Bolsonaro in place of Lula, since Lula had been jailed and he was not able to win. And then he came to New York to talk about the persecution he also suffered, and he was present of the launch. So that continued, right, with all the process of lawfare, and then Bolsonaro elected, and the first actions that he took was against indigenous rights. And so we teamed up with several groups such as Extinction Rebellion and did performances at the skate rink, as you saw, or on in the streets of New York, and the climate marches. And we did an event with the network as well that was happening all over the US, but in New York at NYU with Marielle Franco. And then finally, with a bunch of Brazilian groups, the Free Lula event at the People's Forum brought together the attorneys telling the truth about what Lula had been going through, and also Stan Gasson, who's a union and lawyer, who's a huge member of the US Network and the WBO, the Washington Brazil office. So this was April 2019, Bolsonaro was in power, and that changed a lot the way we started to do things, because so many more people joined us. We started to create groups and coalitions. And so one of the important things coming up here is that when Bolsonaro was awarded or was announced that he was gonna be awarded a prize by the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce, a bunch of groups from the US, from the indigenous rights movements, climate activists, LGBTQ, came together and we helped galvanize that. We saw that energy happen in the city, protests in pro, I wanna play this for you for a second.
New York City protesters rallied outside the Marriott Marquis Hotel in Times Square Tuesday as the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce held a black tie gala dinner honoring Brazil's former President Jair Bolsonaro and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Bolsonaro was initially scheduled to attend the gala but canceled those plans earlier this month after he came under heavy protest over his long history of homophobic, racist, and misogynistic comments. The awards gala was moved from the American Museum of Natural History after a campaign by environmentalists pointed to Bolsonaro's efforts to open the Amazon to deforestation and mining while violating the rights of indigenous people. This is Natalia de Campos of the Defend Democracy in Brazil Committee.
So talking about what Rashan had addressed before in terms of the role, right, of the US, Mike Pompeo in office would be very much an ally to, the anti-Venezuelan sentiment that Bolsonaro also brought up, but also, the selling off of the assets of Brazil, which was what the coup was all about, right, and has been about, of the dismantling of institutions, and so this is when Sawyer an indigenous leader, came to New York, and we Defend Democracy in Brazil, along with We Can, Amazon Watch, did this organization of speaking with her in front of the Brazilian mission to the UN to deliver this letter asking for better measures for indigenous rights. So there were several climate events on that year. And you saw also Esther Solano, we organized a panel where she would talk about the process of Bolsonarization of Brazil, the demonization of the Workers' Party, and how that all brought. And there were several opportunities in the city, and that we took part every year to do that sort of organization, such as the Pride events. And every year we would either denounce Marielle Franco's assassination, MST, which is the Landless Rural Workers Movement's activist assassinations from the LGBTQ movement. And then here at the second national meeting of the USMGB in Washington, we were present and introduced also one of the NST panelists. And then, other solidarity events, such as with the Party for Socialism and Liberation of New York, and the Coletivo Papo Reto from Rio de Janeiro, bringing their narrative. So it became much more about solidarity with the social movements in Brazil than just media advocacy and denouncing or echoing, because we saw how much they were suffering even more after Bolsonaro got elected, but with the dismantling of policies before as well. So a huge partner is Reverend Billy and the Stop Shopping Choir, and we've done several protests with them at JP Morgan Chase, all the corporations, at American Society, which is a big culprit in the selling off the assets, which is sort of houses the corporations of the US that are interested in that. And so with that, we learned so much about solidarity to each other, like also here in New York and in Newark, to other groups, that we started to partner up with these groups more and more. And when the Amazon fires were so high, so up in the air, like for so many people started to understand more easily, there was another way in with the community here to understand that what was really happening in Brazil. And so with the COVID pandemic, the Bolsonaro genocide performance came about to just really denounce how much he could have done more, how much of the bribes he took. We brought the community together here in Newark as well to say, you know, how much your family is worth $1, because he was trying to get bribes by $1 for the vaccines. And we've done several things with the Brazilian Black Coalition for Rights that Gladys mentioned before, and in solidarity with what they were doing during the pandemic to ask for vaccines, for less shootings, for, you know, for more safety, because there were killings inside the favelas when there was a mandate by the Supreme Court that they should not have police action during the pandemic. So this is in Newark again, and this is when we brought this solidarity campaign to start talking to people here and see how will be the reception after we were absolutely, you know, turned down in 2018. But in 2021, people were more approachable. They were really more understanding, and we had flyers informing people about the vaccines and about this genocidal project. But it kept going, right? So that's like, it's so much to talk about because it kept going and it keeps growing at the same time. Last year, we did also projection actions in partnership with Greenpeace and also with other organizations. The Illuminator is a key partner in New York, and they help us with that. And then the Volta Brazil started the campaign that was galvanized by the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, along with the local groups in each state. And then we went out and gave people information on how to register to vote. And people did register in larger numbers, which is in part, you know, a great achievement, seeing now the numbers that Bolsonaro had 60% support in the region of New York in 2018, went down to 48% or 46%. And now Lula is very close. We're only 360 votes for turning around. Maybe in the second round, we'll be able to do that. It's when we launched the Popular Committee along with other people who are new, and Cassiani is here from Newark, from the Harrison, New Jersey region, who joined in, and we did several actions here in the area, as well as in Astoria, which is a Brazilian neighborhood, a concentration of Brazilians in New York. And this is the latest that we've done during the United Nations General Assembly at the time that Bolsonaro would speak again and tell lies. And again, we were denouncing, and this time we were giving first voice to the indigenous community that was here. The delegation could come back after COVID's highest period. And they were here. We did a march, and we did this projection action again with Greenpeace as a partner, and with APIB, which is the articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, and the march in also articulation with Animal Watch. So this is the campaign that is currently still up to Sunday up. We're doing, you know, this is the flyering of telling people 13 reasons why you should elect Lula for the Brazilian community, how he's better for the Brazilian community. And this is the march that we did this Saturday with a carreata, which is a car trail of people, you know, supporting. So if you can support the campaign, you are able to, and we'll let you know how to do it. But basically, this is in 15 minutes, 7 years of work, and in a way to say, you know, how can we activate people, especially here, like the Sawyer. That's why it's so important to be newer, because we were able to activate people that we didn't have any idea that would come out, and people are afraid. So on Saturday, we were giving out stickers, and I have some for you here. We were giving out stickers, and those were people who were shy to come out, you know, because they work with Bolsonaro supporters, they are employed by Bolsonaro supporters. But some were more accepting, and they would take the stickers and they wouldn't speak out, but you could see that things were changing. So I'm hopeful I'll stick with the 6-point difference instead of the 0.5 to 4 that was said earlier by Isabel, right? I will be more hopeful that we will have 6% lead to Lula. And we hope to really rebuild Brazil from, and he will need a lot of support from us here abroad as well. And I think it will be, I want to thank the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil for keeping us together, even though, you know, as I said, sometimes it's hard to manage the left because people are fracturing at a new level when necessary. But I would like to say, you know, it is important to stay together. It is important that we bring people together again and continue. We need more people to help. You know, we need more people galvanized. And the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil has been very instrumental in also making people aware all over the U.S. in every district. And there are 10 voting districts in the U.S. And I want to thank Gladys, who's being the co-coordinator as leading force along with James Green. And the Washington Brazil office was founded because of that. And now it's a nonprofit that is doing work in Washington, D.C., never done before for Brazil. And it's huge, you know, Bernie Sanders came out in support of democracy in Brazil. And we hope that we will know how, you know, democracy is at stake in both countries and how important it is that we keep it together by uniting. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. So we have just a few minutes for questions, but maybe we can go a tiny bit over. But because that could happen, I just want to say, so we go to 4:10. But if people do need to leave, if people have like prior engagements, I also just want to encourage people. We have a ton of food. So especially if you're a student or something, you know, just like get some food with your friends, you know, perhaps. Yeah. But we have till 4:30. Oh, woo! Okay. So the floor is open.
I just want to say it was absolutely fabulous to listen to both of you and to watch your presentation with everything. I mean, at another time I'll be crying. Yeah, probably will be separately. It was absolutely fantastic, and it's so good to know that the way you're working and you have been working against the tide for so long, especially coming from India, what we've heard and spoken, that there is so much silencing and there is so much capitulation to the pressure. There's very little active, you know, public administration. I mean, occasionally there is, but I think it's, yeah, I don't want to talk about India so much, but I want to pick up one point that you mentioned, which recurs in many places, and I identify like you do as an academic activist, right? So I have actually got a long interview about this in a journal in Samaj as an academic activist, of what it means and what it means to be that, which I will send to you and maybe you would like to read. This was a question of fracturing. You mentioned it in the end as well and in the middle. So you said that the right wing is really good at organizing and the left tends to be fractured. This is so true of so many left groups. And for many years, we've been thinking about this, you know, worrying about why does this happen? And I think it has something to do with the way we link. It might have something to do with the way we link thought, thinking, and the critical aspect of thinking with life, and what we do with that thought. And because our politics encourages thinking, critical thinking, and you have to think about this, it encourages more thinking along different lines, if you like. And it also therefore encourages thinking about different possibilities. And so in terms of coming to agree on how you're going to reach whatever possibility you're imagining, it encourages different ways of getting there. And therefore there is something inbuilt in any politics which makes use of thinking that it might lead to the division, which is what happens straight off. But I think the reason it happens is that we aren't very good at linking our thought to our life in the way people we are addressing are linking their thought to their lives. So, sorry, I'm making a long speech and I'm thinking aloud really on this, that I mentioned about how when you interact with people who are attracted to right-wing ideology, Hindu phobia in my case, and you also picked up, that there is a tendency in left-wing thinking to dismiss the connection that people make with their thinking and their life decision as suffering from false consciousness in one word, but generally overriding whatever reasoning process has led people to take those decisions. And I think that is something, there's something deeply wrong with that. But we have to really understand what makes people, what is the thinking process behind this, instead of saying that there isn't any thinking process. Okay, so if somebody is attracted by right TV propaganda, I agree with you. There's always media's, in the Indian case, every channel is sold, but there are only a few which are not. All that is there. Those are the conditions within which people are doing their life, making their life choices. But there still is some thinking. I mean, there are limited options people have at any one point of time. Limited options about job, limited option about vote, limited option about what support they want, and so on. So I think we need to think more about those limitations within which people act. And similarly with our comrades, we need to think about the limitations within which people decide to stand with you or not stand with you. And the final thing I want to say, we must also not, we like to believe that we are all self-sacrificing, or should I say non-aspirational, we are not thinking about it, but there is a great deal of selfishness and greed and hunger for hero worship and whatnot on the side of the left activists, and that is also something which leads to fracturing. So I don't think we should grant that humanity which in everybody, and we've got to be more. I mean, I wouldn't encourage doing what the right wing does, and to discourage thinking. And social media has done a huge disservice, I think, because it means multiplying responses and duplicating other people's responses without thinking. It has encouraged thought. And we need to find, I mean, this is politics on the ground. This is, what you're doing, demonstration, which you have to engage with it. You can't just pass it off. So this is great. I really think this is the way, but yeah, sorry, I've just gone on.
Well, thank you for the question. There's many layers to this, but I think these are really important questions. So yeah, I guess I don't want to think in terms of like a deficit deal about the left because they have money, right? So a lot of this happened pre-Steve Bannon, right? So after 2018, there's a game changer here, right? So we're dealing with a different beast, right? And they have tons of money. Brazilian entrepreneurs, like business people, they're pouring money at Bolsonaro's campaign, right? To spread fake news. And in 2018, I did not believe they were effective. To tell people that the Workers' Party has a gay catch that to be implemented in school, but it plays the people's fantasies about gender ideology that goes back to those things, right? And when we had the event with Lula's daughter here, and journalist Brandon Altman came in and spoke with us, and he said something that I took very seriously. That especially connecting with even the Christian evangelicals, like those things are taken as an attack on family, right? And in communities, poor communities in Brazil, where they have nothing, where the state does not reach, there's no public, right, service or policy. It's the family, right, that hangs people together. And I was also talking with Chun because like Bolsonaro is connected and his son with militias in Rio. Why would people support that, right? But in fact, in communities like in favelas in Rio, where the militia took power, they bring order, right? So I've heard stories that if a husband beats his wife, right, he'll have to right the malicious, right, will intervene, right, and he will suffer consequences. So everything is complex. Just to give you another example, lockdowns, right, in Brazil were executed without any nuance, right? And I think that the left, I think we can look at it like we have also tendencies of being dogmatic, right? And I think like this COVID became a partisan issue with here and there, except that here it made sense because the election was that year. It was 2 years, right, later in Brazil. And a lot of poor people suffered, with the lockdown. I know this man, he killed himself because he used to sell, he had a shop, he used to sell candy in front of a store, in front of a school. And the school was closed for more than a year. His income completely vanished, but not the bills, right? The union, the teachers union in Rio, they refused to go back to school for over a year. And I have a friend who works at Fiocruz, it's a public health research institution, and they wanted to be vaccinated, right? They wanted to cut the line to be vaccinated first. They're like, okay, great, so we can go back to school. No, they did not want to go back to school, right? So these are very real issues, right? I also have I know this guy, he's a pediatrician, right? And then he started a campaign, children's place is in school, right? So I guess what I'm hinting at is that, and if you look at that, like, right, especially when it began in 2016, right? This is a predominantly educated, middle class, white movement. And I guess maybe for an American audience, you cannot just by looking at the picture, because brown folks in Brazil, by and large, still identify and pass as whites. And remember in 2016, once we were there at Union Square, and there's this woman from a working class background, she immigrated here, her kids were born and raised here, and she's like a very white woman. Not that I want to play into this colorism, but she's like right, really nice, and she was, and I was talking with her at the end of the event, and she tells me that she's not going to come back because she doesn't want to mingle with the white elite, and that came as a shock to me, right? So in some ways, I see some parallels that with politics here, right? The Democratic Party being a suburban, highly educated party, and I think your data, right, speak to that, right? So I guess, yeah, we became very effective, right, with these big demonstrations, but if we're thinking of reaching, right, into the working class community, I think we have to, right, to think deeply about our strategies and how to, right, build dialogue, like you're saying, not just say like, oh, these are, right, crazy, irrational individuals. There, we can always find, how this ties in, right, to their, if you will, material interests. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, maybe I wanted just to mention something regarding that because it really brings up a lot, and I think you complimented a lot of what we said. Just addressing, the things that you have done with such a social media and such forms of insertion into public consciousness that is so pervasive right now. But I also think that it's very dangerous, and we have to be very careful in sticking to also what we believe in. And it is very, very important to remember that so especially being in New York, like we're not in Brazil, and we are really just an echo. I mean, we are in solidarity with the movements to bring their voice. And I could not ever think, oh, yeah, I will be always a Latina in one way or another here, but I'm not, brown, and I am here to bring the voice of the majority of the Brazilian population in their own voice. And I think this became much more evident during Bolsonaro, that we have to have a vehicle for the movements to show their own faces. And you see how much it changed from the 2008, 21 projections that we went to the 22, which is, for me, it wasn't important so much to denounce how much he was lying and etc. But it was to say, so we don't care how much he's lying anymore, because he's always going to lie. And to his audience, he's always going to show up as truthful. So it is important that the indigenous people bring their own voice and say, this is why we're fighting for your future, we're fighting for your biomes, our lands, and you need us. You know, if you don't protect us, and if you just pay attention to the liar, then we're not gonna be here anymore next year or in the following year. And so I think it's very important to remember that even though, you know, some people did suffer with COVID, we still have to stick with science. I think we still have to remember that the narrative that COVID could have been better managed is still a reality. And it's not his reality that the lockdowns could have been ended earlier so people could have, no, the state should have been there as the Workers' Party's government was there for people to have support when they needed, to have Bolsa Familia and other programs. And in terms of fracturation, you know, I think there's two ways, maybe I didn't mention two. I think there's a good side to it and there's a bad side. What the bad side is that we become weaker. We cannot, you know, with this amount of actions and the amount of media attention that we received, we could have gotten a lot further if we were all together. But I think the good side is that the fracturation is also a result of our fixes, meaning we are plural and we are different and we think differently and we think that's democracy and we think that's how we want to proceed in life. It takes us longer, but it takes us to a much better place than their place, which is homogenized, you know, full of money, but full of greed and hatred and guns.
I just want to say one little word here, since I'm up. And the first is just about the kind of class issue you mentioned. Well, that's absolutely real and interesting. It's also worth noting for people who may not be familiar with the Brazilian context, that there is still, and to a greater extent than in the United States, a pretty strong correlation with class and voting behavior. So the best predictor of who's voting for Lula is people who make less than 2 minimum salaries per month, which is not a lot of money to live on per month in Brazil. That's how these things are measured. Whereas at the upper echelons, you know, with like Thomas Piketty's talked about to forecast again, the Brahmin left in, you know, kind of Western democracies, that kind of elite, you know, upper middle class people who tend to vote with the left. I think that generally speaking, that phenomenon is significantly less pronounced in Brazil, although it exists. And you know, there's a pretty heavy correlation between position in the class structure and voting behavior. And one other super quick thing that I want to say, because I found the discussion of like COVID really interesting, and Eduardo's point about kind of taking seriously people's discourses, you know, people feeling or having the experience of, you know, their lives getting messed up. And I think this is a complicated position for the left, where we often find ourselves these days on the back foot, like defending institutions against these critiques. And the right is able to kind of like appropriate and suck up the anti-systemic critical energy that the left once used to be pretty good at harnessing. And you know, we should be careful about just dismissing people's kind of like anti-systemic kinds of critiques, you know, because then they just get funneled into the Bolsonaros, which, you know, in this purely anti-political kind of way, that there've got to be better ways for the left to not harness and channel some of that anti-systemic energy into actually, you know, ways that can make people's lives better. So that's it.
One quick note about this. You said like up to 2 salaries, like they tend to vote in favor of Lula, yes. But like we cannot deny that like Bolsonaro has a great popular appeal too, like as Trump has, right? And it may be particularly here in New York with the community here. Like I think he has a majority on the popular side, and we are like kind of, at least like on the election day, like we were divided like the reds and the green and yellows. And one stayed on one side of the street, the other on the other, and you could see clearly that the popular side was on Bolsonaro's side, right? Like it was like this sort of like shocking, a little hard for us to digest that like impression. Right?
Can I just say one thing? I think, I'm not a sociologist, but class in Brazil has changed dramatically. So I think, yeah, like up to 2 million subs, they can support Lula. But then the next level, you know, the lower middle class or a more recent middle class that, you know, right, was up for mobility was recent, right? They support Bolsonaro. Then you go to the upper middle class or the more traditional middle class, right? Then they tend to support Lula. So it's, right, that it's very nuanced, right? And again, and I think this speaks to the issues of race, right? Because one of the threats, right? There's a threat to people's identity, right, as white. And they, like, for example, on my father's side, they are a traditional white upper middle class. My grandfather was a medical doctor, right? Like my cousins and my uncles, they hate Lula because like, when I was growing up, it was a given that I was going to the university. It's no longer the case. I have black people in the university. That never happened before, right? So it's like right when like Lula during his government, like millions, right, were lifted out of poverty. They are competing, right, for in university and the job market. So the traditional middle class, right, was, you know, placed in the sun, right, was secure. It's no longer the case. So, right, I think it's important to think, right, like, yeah, have this more nuanced, you know, class analysis and, you know, with the intersectionality, you know, right, of race being a big factor there.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for all the organizing you've done. I'm going to be sort of the optimist today and say, as the people on the stage have said, and say Lula is going to win this weekend, right? And one of the things about, you know, one of the things that make me optimistic is that if Lula in fact does win this Sunday, I mean, Latin America has become a real bright spot in global politics. I mean, if Brazil, if they elect Lula this Sunday, we're looking at almost like a clean sweep of center-left political ruling parties in most of Latin America, right? And particularly all the bigger countries, right? And so I guess one of my questions is like thinking about Brazil in this kind of larger, I don't want to call it leftist renaissance, right? Because there's still serious issues like Chile's constitutional referendum was voted down recently, right? Which had all these kind of social welfare programs that would have been great, right? But on the other hand, right? Let's assume a Lula victory. We're looking at, yeah, something of a kind of leftist renaissance, which in Latin America that, you know, would make them a kind of a bright spot in world politics. And in some ways, it's remarkable given, right, the history of Latin America, particularly, you know, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and now we have a moment where you have almost a kind of unified center-left political ruling coalition, right? And obviously, there's work to be done and see what happens with that, right? Understand all of that, right? But you know, yeah. So in some ways, it's like a moment to be like, and we gotta wait till Sunday, right? Like, take it in, right? It's like sometimes we can be a little bit, you know, right? Like take it in, relish it for a moment, maybe a day or more, but also think about the achievements here, right? Particularly in Latin America. And I guess my question to you is that, is there something systemic that is happening or occurring in Latin America? Like some sharing common thing that is happening there that is being reflected in the politics and in the voting?
I would like to start because, such a hard question. It is, enerving. I think we're gonna win, but I don't know if that means we're gonna win. In terms of first, the current president will have to accept the results, and with that, we're gonna need help from international country, from all countries to quickly also acknowledge that Lula won and everybody in society. Lula had to put a huge coalition together to get here, which means that Bolsonaro is really powerful. He still has 43% of the vote. And Lula got every possible devil he could. I say devil because, people who were his political enemies in the past and who tried to put him in jail and who were against Dilma and so on, now are his allies as vice president, as opponents who claim to decide to help elect him to deter Bolsonaro. And with that, the Congress was hugely conservative that was elected together in the first round. Lots of senators that are exactly Bolsonaro supporters of agribusiness and the destruction of the Amazon and so on. But we also got some victories, right? We got amazing indigenous activists elected, Black activists elected, women that are for reproductive rights and so on. That is so hard in Brazil because it's such a Catholic and evangelical now country. So I think it is, we have reason to be hopeful because I know these people will fight for their lives, they'll fight 10 times harder, but they do not have the support of agro money and evangelical money and so on. That has been so pervasive that they have created caucus in the Congress that are evangelical caucus and agro caucus and so on that are so powerful and have. So it will be very hard for Lula to govern. So although it's hopeful because the image that we have of Lula is of the Workers' Party rule and also his union leadership and so much that he's done with other leftist leaders in Latin America and in the world during his time in power. And he will try to galvanize that, I'm sure, but he'll have to do a lot of deals and a lot of agreements to just be able to get anything done in Congress. And so I think the first step is to get him recognized by the US government as well and as well as others. But then there's a lot of work to be done on the ground with the political activists, with the social movements, so that he has continuous support from the people. Because, next step could be they try to impeach him or to, or a crazy lunatic does something and then we don't have a wing person in power. We have Alckmin, who was now with him and we support him. It's like, we're doing all this, politicians who were our opponents against Dilma, for example, but now they're our allies because we must get this election. It's one of the most important in history in Brazil.
I guess the short answer to your question of what's going on in Latin America is the utter failure of neoliberal policy, right? In just dismantling any kind of public, program. Like in Brazil, housing, the deficit in housing is just tremendous. But people became, poor, right? And they have nowhere to go. So it's no wonder, right, that this is happening. But yes, like the tricky part here is that yes, this broad coalition, which I must say, it's beautiful to see people coming together to defend democracy. But again, right, that's a middle class, it's a bourgeois ideal, right, to folks who live in poor communities in Brazil. That means it's a lofty abstraction to think about democracy when you're so oppressed, like really people being killed. You go to work and your children, are like the cleaning lady, that works, one of my aunts in Rio. Her son was killed at the bus stop, right? Waiting for the bus to go to work. And this is the daily reality. And you come and you talk about, democracy. So I think we have a lot of, right? When I was talking about COVID, I keep thinking about this image of this famous singer in Brazil, right? In her house with a swimming pool, behind her, urging people, right, to stay home, right? When if you live in a Brazilian favela in the slums, it's impossible to do any social distancing. So I'm being against science or anything, but like you have to, right, think about, people's realities, right? Anyway,
But also democracy in the US is no longer a given anymore. We have to talk about
Right.
defending democracy.
Yeah.
Right here, we may need some help from Brazil pretty soon.
Right.
Because a lot of the same people, a lot of the same money, a lot of the same tactics, a lot of the same diversion of working class anger against, against immigrants, against gay people, against black people. It's all happening here. A lot of it funded by the same people. The Steve Bannon bouncing back and forth. Brilliant guy, brilliant, evil brilliance. But we have to take these people very seriously, and the US is in serious trouble.
Luckily, we have more unionization happening in the US as a result of
Get
COVID.
into that, today was at the, in Williamsburg, Trader Joe's is voting, hopefully they'll vote you. But, things are happening, museums around, we're talking about the museums, voting union, areas that they never got to talk about union before, so there's a lot, bright spots, but it's also very scary spots too. People not be able to take for granted, be able to vote in this country very soon, particularly in places like Arizona or Michigan or Wisconsin. This is very, very scary stuff, and they learned some of their tactics in Brazil, the fascists, and bring it back here. And then you got Italy, a lot of things to be scared about, but also a lot of things to be optimistic about.
Hi, thank you for this panel. I guess my question is bringing the discussion here to Newark, and your approach now with the elections. Have you been noticing a pattern of people approaching you now that they are more open to talk among Brazilians? Are they from a certain generation? Are they from a certain race? Is there a common pattern that you're observing that people are getting more open to talk to you here in the Brazilian community? And if there is other Latin Americans that are reaching to you or open to conversation, and where are they from?
Yeah, so on Saturday, there was, thanks for the question, because it's very important, and we're observing as we go, right? Because it's very new that there is more support, and since last year, we put out a table, and then people came and talked, we had signs, and we're clearly for Lula, and we're clearly against Bolsonaro. More people approached and talked to us. Some have been immigrants for a long time, but we saw also a large group of very new immigrants who just arrived, who are undocumented, who also just, are not ready, not even, a lot of people came to talk to us, they were supportive, but they are not even registered to vote yet. They didn't even know that they could transfer their voting card to the US or how to do it. And so they were reached also by some of our campaigns. And it is hard to know where to reach them, right? And because we thought, oh, maybe the evangelical churches are a way to outreach, but also it's very hard to penetrate. And then there are supporters who are evangelical, Lula supporters, but they are afraid to come out, basically. But we got more support. Like I said, shy in a way. People would get, everybody was mentioning that on the break, but people did get more stickers out of the windows of their cars, but they were timid. And then the Latino community, 100% support. Like Ecuadorians or Mexicans I spoke to, they were just like, they knew who Lula, and I had several different, right? The 13 number, but also had with Lula, so they recognize immediately, they know who Lula is and how he is a representative of the, and if Thiago and Cassiani want to compliment.
Was mentioning that the COVID was a turning point, right? Like we came last year and there were like a lot of people concerned saying that they had people in their family that died, and that like they were really, how to say, scared with the kind of non-treatment that they were getting from the Brazilian government, right?
Yeah. And but like I said, like at least 50% of people I spoke to were new immigrants, like 6 months, 2 years, 3 weeks, and so on. So they're really concerned, and some actually have joined our group are political refugees. Actually, they got political asylum because of being persecuted.
I think we have time for one final question.
Okay, sorry. I guess it's a comment.
I want to say something very cynical, but I see Brazilian politics akin to a Tom and Jerry dynamic, because 4 years ago, when Bolsonaro won, then it was like, oh my God, first that surprise, and then people started reorganizing for 2022. So if Lula wins on Sunday, that's what's gonna happen. It's like the other side is gonna be, yeah, we're gonna be organizing ourselves to get back into power. I'm not saying that they will, but that's how I see the dynamic. And then the other thing is that, as Isabella mentioned in the morning, there's so many political parties in Brazil that it's a joke, because they don't really have platforms. They have, they're vying for power. So in Brazil, whoever's in power will have to make coalitions. And I don't know, of course, you've noticed that a lot of people said, people who are declaring their vote for Lula now, a number of them, I said, I have never voted for PT. I have never voted for Lula. I did not vote for Joe, but this year it's important. So then it's not a matter of being wedded to Lula's platform. It's a matter of Tom and Jerry, who is winning? I gotta get back in power. So in a way, it's very counterproductive.
I agree, but I also think that this time we've grown into consciousness that we don't demobilize after Lula gets elected. I think it will be very important.
That's actually something I forgot, to mention, that Brazilian presidentialism, right, is in deep crisis, because you're absolutely right. Who's in power in Brazil is Congress, right? So the leader of the House, that is the most powerful, it's usually a man, like has always been a man actually in Brazil, right? So the president is actually hostage, right, to them, because you cannot pass one bill without giving something in return. We call this, we say this the physiological, right, Congress. And that is one place that a lot of public education needs to happen, because that happened before, with Dylan. That's why she was impeached, because she was not, good at negotiating, right? And Lula was skilled at that. And that's what the corruption scandals, they all tied to that, right? And Bolsonaro was repeating the same thing, but people don't know that. And actually, I think it's tragic that we vote for president on the same day that we're voting for Congress, right? But anyway, so that has been on the agenda, political reform, for a while, and that's critical. And I think that's one of the areas that we need to mobilize. So I think going forward, we have to not just mobilize against partisan politics, but right through these, topics, right? Mobilize for those reforms. And Gladys, you also mentioned PSOL, right? And that was actually very important, because in the early stage of when they were planning the coup against Dilma, like the left, the PSOL, like they did not support the Workers' Party. They were well deserved to the Workers' Party, because they did engage in corruption. They tried, right? They took to the master's tool to dismantle the master house, and that doesn't work. And then, right? And then later they realized that what was at stake, right, was much larger, just with the Nishiya out, right? The campaign against the Workers' Party was huge, and and lasted for years, until they realized that, well, actually Bolsonaro is something, right? It's a monster that nobody can control, right? So now it's time to, right, to rethink and reorganize.
I think we're now over time, so I just want to thank all of you. I want to thank our panelists, the many panelists who are out there as well. You all gave fantastic talks. To thank those of you who hung out until the end and those who left. It's been a great day. Thank you all so much, and yeah, bye-bye.
Just want to make an announcement that if anybody is in New York or wants to go to New York on Sunday, we'll have a vote count party at the People's Forum from 4:30.
Hopefully a celebration.
And I know that people also are going to get together at this restaurant in Astoria called Beit of Lua. So hopefully there'll be a big party there too.